my name's Shourov. I'm the CEO of a company called Polonize. And in my background, I'm a deep technologist as well as someone who comes from a deep education background, both family and professionally. I was very much into, that alternative career almost happened as a academic and someone in education. But I did come out into entrepreneurship, and I've always cared a lot about human skills development, and in particular, the development of new skills for new generations. Spent a lot of time running my own accelerators, etc. And bringing technology to bear there. So where we've landed with this company, Polonize, is to use the best of technology, which now means AI, to train humans. So using AI infrastructure back onto humans to actually improve ourselves and our cognition and make us ready for the world and give us control over our own careers. That's not necessarily something that you hear a lot. Most of the time we're looking at using AI to improve work, flows and tasks, and perhaps even replace humans. We take an alternative approach, a complementary approach, which is to apply the best principles of machine learning, which have been wildly successful at training machines, and apply them back onto humans. We've built a core infrastructure to do that. And so that
There's something quite fascinating by the concept of deploying a technology to teach people about the technology itself, right? I mean, there's a little bit of a meta going on here. I was talking to someone also this morning. It sounds like all I do is get on the phone and talk to people, but I happened to be talking to someone this morning who was used a vibe coding tool to write a vibe coding tool, and got it actually functionally working. And then they hit some architectural things where the one they built didn't have access to the APIs and things that the first one did, so they hit some walls. But I thought it was super fascinating, and it reminds me of the computer science theory that you build the next compiler on the current compiler. But so this idea of stacked education is something I'm not as familiar with, but I just wonder if that's been an interesting thing where you're the thing we need to teach someone about is the thing we're using to teach them about it, and how does that change your approach to education, learning, etc.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Neil. This is actually very deep, sophisticated thinking that I've only recently come upon myself. This manifests actually, if you're a sophisticated user of AI, as you are, you're already using AI to generate instructions for AI. This is actually a big deal. I'll take a quick analogy. Back in the early days of computing, we separated code and data. In fact, we didn't even have code. We built machines to do the computation with vacuum tubes. And when we wanted more power or a different task, we built a new machine. So in the 50s, a couple of those early computer scientists, they took this huge step back then of saying, well, we've got data, why don't we make code into data? And that unleashed the Turing machine and computation version 1. I think we're at a similar stage here, where when you use these brains, these AI machine learning brains, to create the instructions for themselves, you've actually gone more than stacked. You've gone into recursive. And the description of that system, the way you control that system, and the science of that system is a complete new category. It actually doesn't follow the rules that we had before it. So it's a very exciting time.
Yeah, I was talking to one of the people I mentioned about technology learning cycles, and I remember, as I'm sure you do, the way we all learned in the early days of the internet was view source, right? We just went to a web page. There was no server-side technology. It was all client-side. And you, especially with just HTML, you would open it up and be oh, that's how they built a table. Oh, that's how they built whatever, right? And we just looked at things we liked and learned. And what's fascinating now is we've kind of abstracted so many layers of things. When you look at a vibe coded thing, for example, there's this whole theory about can you have a vibe coding tool export a prompt that you'd hand portably to someone that would actually allow them to input it and have it build exactly the same thing. So that's different than handing them the Git repo, but that's a fascinating thing if the thing can explain itself. And I was actually watching part of Dharmesh's keynote at Inbound, and he was just talking about prompts that he uses to make his own prompts better, right? He's constantly saying, I just wrote this, how can I have done it better? So this is this recursive learning and tool usage, which is a very unfamiliar pattern for most people, right? When we're trying to software is very deterministic, and so when you use it, you can explain, you can click on this and this thing happens, right? Or maybe like they have these options for this thing to happen. But now we have this very undeterministic interface to everything, which is insanely powerful for those that know how to use it, but also like a pattern and a UX that's not, that like people have to get used to. The slowest change agent is the human. There are some departments and some functions that are very aggressively trying to adopt AI and having various levels of success with it. I'm finding that it's been really hard for the human resources side of things to like just contemplate where to start, right? There's so many things. How do we upskill people? How do we transform our department? You know, what's our role in the organization, et cetera? That a lot of it has sort of been almost a reverse response, which is to sort of like almost like do nothing. I just was talking to a prospect of our product who was super excited. Great fit for what they were doing. Huge benefit. It's just heard back from him. It's like, hey, yeah, we kind of like try to push this through, but we're not going to do it yet. We're going to kind of revisit when we've got a better sense of like how people and culture kind of interact with AI. He said that time frame looks about like 12 months. And my first reaction is to laugh, like, oh my God, like, you know, like we're the world will be in such a different place in 12 months. But I didn't, because I'm hearing this and feeling this from a lot of organizations right now. There's almost like a push me, pull you thing going on where it's so overwhelming. You know, there's a lot of data coming out, you know, like that MIT study that's been passed around 1,000 times, 95% of projects fail or whatever, which is, you know, was sort of a poorly constructed study, but like it doesn't matter. There's a whole lot of like, I think, you know, AI startup pilots, you know, are not getting renewed, you know, blah, blah, blah. But then you have this bifurcated story where you also have these like insane success stories, right? And so it's this funny moment in the world where I think people are actually kind of fleeing to the edges. Either they're just like all in, all gas, no brakes, right? Let's go. Or they're like, you know what? I'm actually going to hang out. I'm going to wait a bit. I'm going to not that pilot. I'm going to wait 12 months. And I don't know which end of that spectrum is likely to blow up, right, more, right? Is it like you put all this time and energy into it, like no one adopts it, you spent all the money and energy, or like do you sit on the sidelines for 12 months and then like the world has progressed so far that you are steamrolled by your paralysis. And it's interesting as an AI technology vendor in this space. It's interesting as a thinker about it. It's interesting as a transformation expert, right? Which I kind of think of you are from our conversations. And especially talking to people about how they themselves are transforming, right? People that they work with, et cetera. Like, I'll just say it, maybe the TLDR on this, like, I think like pacing is an interesting question right now for everybody. Like, you know, maybe 3 months ago I was like, everybody just goes as fast as they can, right? And now I'm like, well, it's not. I still think they should, but I don't think they're going to. So it's an unformed thought, but like that's part of what's fun about these conversations. Like, how does that strike you? Is that what you're seeing? Does it make you anxious? Is that an opportunity for you? Like, how do you think about that?
Absolutely see it. Absolutely makes sense rationally, right? You know, if you look at it objectively. And human beings are human beings. Again, just to stress the point that this is what happens when you leave humans out of the loop. A lot of that conversation doesn't take into account our cognitive capabilities, what we like, you know, and our need for security and things like that. I also think, though, that this is actually the symptom of a deeper structural change, or let's say a legacy structure that we now need to change. All of these things are actually, if you think about it, symptoms of over-centralization. The idea that HR will train everyone is fundamentally what's causing this. The overwork is because they have to do everything. What we see, and what we're very interestingly seeing, is that our early commercial activity around upskilling for AI tool use is actually working perfectly in a decentralized way, either at team or even individual level. The work we're doing is that individuals are upskilling themselves effectively for AI tool use, and it makes sense. A lot of these revolutions are driven from top down, but also bottom up. There's a structural change that's happening where teams want autonomy to be able to train themselves. And to respond to that means we can't use rigid hierarchical models, you know, rolling out exactly the same training and in a compliance mindset, controlling the boundaries of that training with zero autonomy for a team or an individual is is obviously going to cause to massive stress for that centralized team. So for their sake, and for the sake of the people who want this training autonomously, a key word for me has been autonomy, and really philosophically always been part of the DNA of what we do.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's funny, I was just talking to someone before, and he's very invested in programs that are helping, kind of upskill, reskill, workforces, and also like people entering the workforce. And one of his observations was that there's a sort of a organizational change that will evolve as well as AI comes in. So a vision of the future is, that, humans do 100% of the work now and agents do 0, but then in the next number of years, agents will do 60, 80% of the work and humans will do 20. In that kind of an organization, there's also like a different type of organization. There's no need for centralization. People's roles become more, reviewer, operational, orchestrator, that kind of thing. And in that world, he was suggesting that organizational structure moves a little bit more to a network model, right? Away from a hierarchical model. Middle management is essentially evaporated by AI technology, right? There's not a lot of need for it. These things are all kind of like relatively extreme ways of saying them. But I think it's a little bit of another way of saying what you're saying, which is a lot of these things are going to happen in a decentralized fashion. I have a hard time seeing many organizations that are going to get their retraining, upskilling, et cetera, from HR, right? that just doesn't feel like the place that it's going to come from. I don't know what the alternative is to it, right? It's garbage. It was decentralized to the professional, right? In the early days of CRM, people that were using Goldmine or Axe, if you remember those things, were just this is insane. I'm going to go put a license to Salesforce on my own credit card, and I'm going to use it because I like it a lot better and it works for me. And so you got hyper decentralization in terms of the adoption of technology. And then all of a sudden, department managers saw that 6 or 7 people were using the software, and they're let's just go buy a license, and all of a sudden the company was using it. I think that's pretty, it rhymes, right? To sort of use that approach to history, it rhymes a lot with what I see happening in AI now, but that is sort of in conflict with some of these we have to be AI first, we have to, evolve our organization, right? I don't remember a CEO getting up and saying, we have to be a cloud organization. No, it was just something that kind of made sense from the bottom up over time. So we have this funny dissonance right now between mandate here, right? We have to survive and do it this way, and actual operational activity is happening way at the leaf nodes. Few are able to rein that back into kind of any centralized thing. I mean, as an example, I had this little vibe coding group for marketers, and it's in a Slack Connect channel, and one of the women in there was saying hey, they actually got a company-wide policy on note takers, where everybody uses the same AI note taker. And I was you're way ahead of the curve, right? Even something as simple as let's all just use the same thing so we can automate it the same way is a very centralized activity inside of AI that I think most companies haven't even contemplated yet. Lots of thoughts, not a lot of conclusions, but there will be a revolution, but how and where it happens and comes from is, I think, very up in the air.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, to create a space for that evolution to happen. I mean, as leaders, we can do that straight up. And that does mean letting go of control. I mean, logically, that transformation has to come first with the letting go and creating a space. We can't have every aspect of the legacy model. It's going to play out, and again, we can rush ahead and speculate, and a lot of people are incentivized to do that. That's the first point I would make, because that's already actually a big step. The important question you asked there, though, in that passage is, what is the alternative for, say, HR? Our answer to that, which we're starting to see and respond to and build, is that you create environments for people to flourish in. And the creation of those environments is the job. It's high-level work, and it needs tooling, it needs technology, and it needs core infrastructure. So, for example, to make that a little bit concrete, you could put together a closed-form training program and roll it across your organization. That's a behavior that we're very used to doing. It's very tractable. All the tooling is there. It's a solved problem in a lot of ways, and people are used to receiving that as a habit of, training themselves. But that generic training will not respond to, localized influences. And in today's day, it just doesn't move fast enough, right? You're training people on yesterday's stuff. So when we move to let's call it a more autonomous or dynamic training environment, what is then the role of HR? Well, they'll come in, they'll set up the analysis engines and the metrics saying, what are we interested in terms of competencies? What kind of metrics are we looking for out of this? What are the expectations you should have to measure yourself to? What are the benchmarks? And let's control that aspect, but let the actual generation of these training programs happen through AI in a localized way. But we'll be able to control. It's not that we're losing control, but it's moving that control up to another layer. And I will take cloud as an analogy here, because early on, when I started my career, we had first level computing. It was the machine on the desk and the software, everything. And I got paid a lot of money to go in and do that and put the Microsoft Access database on it, and everything's locked down. So there was that model there. And then the cloud, AWS, which is a great case study to look at. How did they dominate that revolution? By building the core infrastructure, which allowed a new level of control. So now I'm not telling you necessarily how to engineer everything, but maybe I'm setting up an account around how you spin up your servers, what sort of infrastructure rules we're going to use, what are the core workflows we have, etc. Very, very different, right, to the early stage of IT pre-cloud. And that's how I see it. It's actually really, if you look at what is called reinforcement learning, going through a loop, and the learning is inevitable. There is a model that, as you say, this is an unfamiliar pattern. We've come from a deterministic world where it's a one-shot thing. Like, here's an input, here's the expected output, here's the training, go and do it. You ticked it, you got it through, right? That's the world we've come for. By the way, for software engineers, this is deeply unsettling too. We've come from and been trained on a deterministic world. The community of technologists who gets this, and this is why I'm looking to really start connecting our work into machine learning community, is machine learning and AI, deep tech people, because they're the ones who very, very, very successfully built the learning scaffold for the neural networks, which are essentially not that different to what I grew up with 30 years ago. But what has changed is our ability to train them through fast iterative, what's called supervised and reinforcement learning. So there is a model that exists for this. So when you're going through and using AI, you're doing that with your brain. You're adjusting the parameters of your neural network in such a way that even without knowing it, you got better at this meta skill, which you then found suddenly very useful in your work elsewhere. So if we just bring to bear a little bit of thinking on that and structure, that's essentially where we start to unlock huge value. And if you put it in those terms, people do see analogies. There are other spheres in life where we have this fast loop reinforcement learning. Sport is one of them, for example. Gaming is another one. Places where we don't have this rigid top-down linear academic model, we quickly learn things by doing on the job. Those are the kind of words we use. But now it's time to bring a lot of science and technology there. So I love that story of yours. That is the archetypical story of a human upskilling rapidly for the future of AI. I think you've just lived it out. It's absolutely so important. I'm glad you brought it up. It extends across everything you mentioned, even into things like more fundamentally, as we are talking about here, this new methodology means a lot of iteration, which means a lot of mistakes. Learning comes through falling short. Culturally, is that accepted? The propensity to experiment, the propensity to autonomously do things, rigid hierarchical organizations, people don't even often take that first step. Couple of points I'll make. This device here is actually a real portal for most of the global south, especially. This is technology, this is the internet, and this is the computer. So one thing where we find is if you get people something into their hands that they can do, that's already giving them the autonomy. And I'll bring that up again as part of the solution here, is that to combat or to equalize, if you like, a centralized playing field is never really going to be possible because the biases come from the centralization. I'm very interested and looking at edge computing and running models on phones for this reason, so that people can actually train themselves in their privacy of their own environments, but also do it the way they want it. And I think actually, interestingly, even these meta skills and cultural attributes, like what you mentioned, am I good at asking questions? Am I willing to try something out? AI can even help us with that. And actually, a couple of our partnerships are going in that. What is being called, I guess, cultural skills. You know, one of our partners said that to me yesterday. Well, can we just introduce a little bit of cultural skills training, just so that we can get some of these core behaviors equalized across a multinational? And I thought that was a very interesting ask coming from the market. So that's why it's so important to look at this and broaden this out to bring in different modalities and again give that autonomy for this to happen in certain ways. I mean, we've been trained in our context, in our culture, to look at this in a certain way. As a technologist, I see this feedback loop as being primarily text driven, directive driven. But there are many other ways, and we don't have to worry about it not mapping. Fundamentally, human beings biologically, the biology is with us. This is how we learn, right? We have very fast feedback loops through our sense making, and we modify our neural networks in response. We now know that. And that's happening at all ages. We used to think it only happens for the young. In fact, it's happening right now. And it can't be stopped. There's no such thing as walking into a training room and then walking out again and learning stops. The biological congruence is 100% there. We'll never have to worry about it not working for a human being. That's the beauty of the analogy, right? And I'd make the point the AI revolution is built on a stack that's fundamentally mimicking neural networks. We're mimicking the one form of intelligence we do know, which is our own brains. But yes, the different, let's say, officers of a large pharmaceutical firm around the world, and those countries are now saying that we will work, but in our own way. Don't impose your culture on us. And that's a very much, that's the frame within which there's a problem to be solved. I'm very excited about how we can solve that problem by giving people these platforms and environments to build, but let them do it in their own way. They will find a way to do this. It's not that there's, the Western culture that can do this and Eastern cultures are fundamentally not capable of